say, okay, here's a box, we fit into that. How did we get into that box? How did that box that humans fill come to be? What's the evolutionary history of that? Why do we have the features that we have? Why do we have big brains? Why do we live in houses? Why do we? How do we know enough to be able to make glasses to correct our vision? Why do we have beards and no hair on our heads and these sorts of things? Why do we write things in books? And no other animal does these sorts of things. This is what anthropology and physical anthropology is trying to explain, is not just what, but why and from where. So if we're related to all other primates, when did we start to diverge? When did we start to split? Well, this can be explained through the principle of what's called natural selection. And this is something that Charles Darwin gave us 150 years ago, or more, actually. And then number 6, the 6th course objective is to apply evolutionary theory to the description and explanation of patterns of biological and behavioral diversity, with specific attention to human diversity and the non-biological bases for the social construction of race. So, 2 things here. 1, we're ultimately interested in humans. So, why are humans different from all other animals? That's what we covered in the last question. But also, where does our diversity come from within the human species? So why are we not all identical to one another? What are our differences between you and me? Where do those come from? And there are biological, physical reasons, and there are cultural reasons as to why we differ from one another. So we will look at this through the lens of evolutionary theory. And the course objective also wants to take on one aspect of this diversity of humans, that is the concept of race. And I want to be very clear from the very beginning of this course, there is no biological basis for race. Biologists do not consider there to be human races. There is only one race, that is the human race. So why are we different? Why do we categorize people into different races? Well, this is partly where the subdisciplines of anthropology start to articulate. It is a cultural construction. Races are not something that we find in biology, or at least within the human species. We are all one group. We can all interbreed with one another, and that is ultimately what we mean by a species or a race. So there are no biological races amongst humans. So where does this come from? Well, these are socially constructed. These are things that we decide that we want to categorize each other by, but they are not biological. There is no biological reason for us to consider one race or another race. They're all superficial, phenotypic expressions that have very clear reasons for why they exist based on environmental factors, that we will look at some of the environmental factors that lead to some of these phenotypic superficial traces. So, for instance, I'm an extremely pale person, and I don't do really well in the Las Vegas climate. Why is that? Well, because my ancestors lived in an environment where sunlight was a premium. And sunlight is something that human beings need to survive. Without access to sunlight, we're not able to process vitamin D, and you can have health problems because of that. So my ancestors lived in a place where the natural sunskin, which is your pigmentation, was a hindrance to absorbing UV radiation, which was important for survival. So my ancestors, natural selection, selected those individuals for survival that had paler skin. And if someone lives more equatorial, or your ancestry comes from a place in more southern equatorial latitudes, you might have darker complexion because there was too much sunlight in those places. And the other end of that spectrum is that if you have too much UV radiation, you can have damage to your cells, and that can cause other health problems. So our human bodies are looking for that sweet spot, and we adapt our complexion to those local environmental factors. So the only reason why you would call me white race is because my ancestors came from a northerly region. And if someone else is of another race based on their complexion, that's because they came from a place that was closer to the equator. And anywhere in between, you're going to see a gradation. That's really all it is. That's really all what we call race has to do with biology, and it really just is adaptations to local conditions. So why do we have these categories? Well, there's history to that, and it's a social history. It's about colonialism, it's about economics, it's about exploitation, and it's about justification for these sorts of bad systems that went on. Let's face it, slavery was a bad thing, and in order to justify that, science actually participated in justifying these things through what we now call scientific racism. And anthropology has things to answer for. We're now coming through that. Anthropology was used 100 years ago by people to justify these racial differences. But now anthropology, because it's a science, can test and retest these hypotheses, ask difficult questions, and come through to something that's more accurate. And that's where we stand today. So these course objectives, I encourage you to read them and know what they say, because we're going to come back over and over to these points. And ultimately, that's what I'm going to be testing you on, is if you know what the course objectives are. So all of the lessons that we're going to have, all of the quizzes that we're going to have, and even the essay question that I'm going to give is going to be about some of these aspects of these course objectives. It all boils down to that. So welcome to the course. Feel free to challenge me, ask me questions, and challenge yourself as well. Enjoy the course, and we'll be in touch soon. Thanks.